the low-tech speaker for the day. I want to thank all of you for being here. I've been speaking all over the country on the issue of Agenda 21. And we used to talk to some fairly empty rooms. The average audience was about 50 to 75. Today that is growing. I had 350 people in Atlanta on Saturday. I've got 850 people in Wisconsin coming up. I've been speaking to thousands of people about this over the last year. And I'm going to speak kind of quickly. I apologize for that, for you trying to take notes, but this issue is vast and complicated, and I want to get it all out. But whenever I or any of my associates talk about Agenda 21 as it pertains to U.S. or state laws, we are accused of perpetrating a conspiracy theory that the UN is taking over our country. Our opponents are quick to point out that the UN has no enforcement capability and that there are no UN officials overseeing our city council chambers and there are no blue-helmeted UN troops marching in our streets. That is true. The fact is, Agenda 21 is making its way into American policy in a much more subtle and difficult to follow path. Let me try to explain it. The term sustainable development was born on the pages of the UN's document called Our Common Future, the official report of the 1987 UN World Commission on Environment and Development. As a result of this report, for the first time, the use of environmental protection and human development were tied to the age-old socialist goals of international redistribution of wealth. And that is the key to understanding the true purpose of sustainable development and all of its policies, control of all facets of the economy. Here's how the UN described Agenda 21 in one of its own publications in 1993 in an article entitled Agenda 21, the first summit, the Earth Summit Strategy to Save Our Planet. It says, quote, Agenda 21 proposes an array of actions which are intended to be implemented by every person on Earth. It calls for specific changes in the activities of all people. Effective execution of Agenda 21 will require a profound reorientation of all humans unlike anything the world has ever experienced. I've never heard a more incredible definition of government. Here is the exact course that brought Agenda 21 to America and into our local communities. The infrastructure pushing the Sustainable Development Agenda is a vast international matrix, and at the top of the heap is the United Nations Environmental Program, the UNEP. But the UNEP doesn't operate on its own. Influencing it are thousands of non-governmental organizations, NGOs. This is the key. These are private groups which seek to implement a special political agenda, and through the UN infrastructure, particularly through the UNEP, they have great power. And I should point out that a true NGO group is officially sanctioned and certified by the United Nations to participate in these international meetings. They don't just show up and say, hey, we're a group. They have to fill out an application. It's about that thick. And when they fill it out, they pledge that they're going to promote United Nations policies. Now, prior to the 1992 UN Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, these sanctioned NGO groups spent considerable time writing and creating the document that would be introduced to the world as Agenda 21. At the Earth Summit, nearly every head of state signed the agreement to follow Agenda 21, including President George H.W. Bush. Agenda 21 is not a treaty that has to be ratified by the Senate. Rather, it's what's known as a soft law policy, a guideline that the nation agrees to implement through its own legislative process. And that's why it's so difficult to follow the bouncing ball from the United Nations down into your city council. President Bush, in signing the document, committed the U.S. to implement the policies of Agenda 21. That sent the policy into our own federal bureaucracy, which started it in motion. Agenda 21 then gained huge momentum when in 1993, President Bill Clinton issued an executive order to create the President's Council on Sustainable Development and made it official U.S. policy. And serving on that council were many of the same NGO groups which helped write Agenda 21 at the United Nations level, all players in creation of Agenda 21, now openly serving on the President's Council with a specific mission of implementing Agenda 21 into American policy. Included at the UNEP table to develop the policy, along with all of these NGO groups which helped write it in the first place, are these players, an incredible mix of our federal government. These include the Department of State, the Department of Interior, the Department of Agriculture, the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Park Service, the U.S. Forest Service, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. These agencies are represented at all UNEP meetings to help write policy. Now, why do they do that if Agenda 21 is just a myth that has no effect on our government? The purpose of the President's Council was to translate the guidelines of Agenda 21 into public policy to be administered by the federal government. And that step-by-step process translated into the ruling authority through which a UN plan, Agenda 21, has become unquestioned U.S. policy throughout America. It was invented by NGOs through the UN. It was brought to the U.S. through the President's Council, and through federal and state legislation, it is being implemented on the local level through the involvement of NGOs who helped write it in the first place, step by step by step. Sustainable development is not a local idea or a local policy. So, what is sustainable development? Sustainable development is about a planned central economy and redistribution of wealth on a local, state, national, and international level. The process by which it is implemented creates a matrix of locked-away land or severe land use controls, control of energy and energy production, control of transportation, control of industry, control of food production, control of development, control of water availability, and control of population size and growth. Most of their policies and regulations are issued under the excuse of protecting the environment. This is the process through which America is being transformed. It is what local authorities are really doing when they're using terms like comprehensive development plans and energy audits and open space and historic preservation. That is Agenda 21 and sustainable development. And Agenda 21 is not just policy. It is a complete system to change the way we think, the way we react, the way we make decisions, and those who promote it have very specific answers as to how they want you to do each of these things. That's why they call it an agenda. One of the main focuses of Agenda 21 is something called social equity. And I'll tell you right now, if you fail to recognize and understand the social equity aspect of Agenda 21, then you have no grasp of this issue. Social equity is based on a demand for social justice. You hear this term day in and day out now. Social justice is described as the right and opportunity of all people to benefit equally from the resources afforded us by society and the environment. That is a nice way of saying redistribution of wealth. And by the way, Karl Marx was the first to coin the phrase social justice. The sustainabilist system is based on the principle that individuals must give up selfish wants for the needs of the common good or the community. You will hear the word community used throughout sustainabilist literature. According to the sustainabilists, it is a social injustice for some to have prosperity if others do not. Profits are made at the expense of the people. This becomes a great threat to property owners and business owners as they are targeted by government policy based on social justice. That becomes a government that does not recognize property ownership and sees no problem in taking it at will for the common good. Another danger to individual American citizens is the economic policy of Agenda 21 that is based on public-private partnerships, sometimes called corporatism. It is not capitalism or free markets. though it may have some of the trappings. The marketplace is still there, but ultimately, corporatism does not trust the marketplace to impose its desired policies. The partnerships allow for special tax breaks, access to land for some developers, but not for others, non-compete clauses in government projects that guarantee what they call profits, access to grants and lucrative special government programs, and much more. Under public-private partnerships, there is a guarantee of protection and profits. Corporations that play ball get the power of government, and government gets to hide behind the independence of private business. Thus, the partnership between corporations and government is done at the expense of ordinary people, the exact opposite effect of free markets controlled by consumers. Eminent domain is the tool of choice of public-private partnerships, confiscation of private property for the public good. And these policies are enforced under the excuse of protecting the environment. To understand the power of the transformation of society under sustainable development, consider this quote from the UN's Biodiversity Treaty that was also introduced at the 1992 Earth Summit. It said, quote, "Nature has an integral set of different values, cultural, spiritual, and material, where humans are one strand in nature's web and all living creatures are considered equal. Therefore, the natural way is the right way and human activities should be molded along nature's rhythms." End quote. This quote lays down the ground rules for the entire Sustainable Development Agenda. It says humans are nothing special. Just one strand in the nature of things, or put another way, humans are simply a biological resource. And you want to know why they can walk in and throw your products down the sewer, they can come in and take your land, because you're just one step in the process, and the tortoise down the street's got more rights than you do. Sustainablest policy is to oversee any issue in which man intersects with nature, which of course is literally everything. This is necessary, sustainabilists say, because man only defiles nature. And private property ownership and control is a main target of sustainable development. Consider this quote from the report of the 1976 UN Habitat I Conference, which said, quote, "Land cannot be treated as an ordinary asset, controlled by individuals and subject to the pressures and inefficiencies of the market. Private land ownership is also a principal instrument of accumulation and concentration of wealth, therefore contributes to social injustice." That's your home, by the way. The fact is, Agenda 21 is a blueprint to completely change our society to a top-down, planned central economy in a strange mixture of socialism, fascism, and corporatism. And so, federal and state governments working hand in hand with a horde of non-governmental organizations, private groups with personal political agendas, force passage of rules and regulations passed down to local communities. Everything connected to sustainable development translates to higher costs, shortages, and sacrifice. The best way to understand what sustainable development actually is can be found by discovering what they consider is not sustainable. Maurice Strong, the Secretary General of the UN's Earth Summit in 1992, said, quote, "Current lifestyles and consumption patterns of the affluent middle class involving high meat intake, use of fossil fuels, appliances, home and work air conditioning, and suburban housing are not sustainable." So, how is this wrenching transformation taking place? There are 4 very specific routes being used. In the rural areas, it's called the Wildlands Project. In the cities, it's called smart growth. In business, it's called public-private partnerships. And in government, it's called stakeholder councils and non-elected boards and regional governments, or reinvented government. Let me take them one at a time. The Wildlands Project was the brainchild of Earth First's Dave Foreman, and it literally calls for, in his words, the rewilding of 50% of all the land in every state back to the way it was before Christopher Columbus set foot here. Thomas Lovejoy, a science advisor to the Federal Department of Interior, said, quote, We will map our nation, determine development for the whole country, and regulate it. But how do we remove people from the land? There are many tools in place to stop human activity and grow the wilderness. Deny grazing and water rights on public lands. Lock away natural resources by creating national parks. Label specific land to be wetlands with no development allowed. And use the Endangered Species Act as a major weapon to kill the forest industry, shut down the mills, and kill jobs. The state of Maryland is considering a ban on septic tanks as a means to protect the Chesapeake Bay, even though there is no evidence whatsoever that septic tanks do any damage. The only result of that ban will be to make it impossible to live in the rural area unless you want to spend several $1 million on your own private water treatment system. The Wildlands Project comes in many names and many programs. Wilderness areas, comprehensive land use plans, bikeways, greenways, heritage areas, land management, rails to trails, open space, wolf and bear reintroduction, conservation easements, and many more. Each of these programs is designed to make it just a little harder to live on the land, a little more expensive, a little more hopeless. In reality, the process is simply herding people off rural lands and into human habitat areas or our cities. The second path to sustainable development is called smart growth. They put a line around the city and they tell you no growth can take place outside of that. Urban sprawl, they say disdainfully. Fewer roads are built, causing gridlock and restricting mobility. The alternative offered is the creation of light rail trains and other public transportation at a massive cost to the public. The new ploy is to force cars to share the road with bicycles, the complete street, they call it. In many smart growth cities, new apartment buildings now have no garages or parking lots. Smart growth creates an unnatural restriction on space inside the controlled city limits, so now there is a shortage of houses. And what happens? Prices go up. And that means populations will have to be controlled because now there is a shortage of land. Believe it or not, sustainabilists call for an 85% reduction in human population. Now, I've made arrangements with Sheriff Mack. When this is over, outside we're going to have some containers of Kool-Aid, and I would like all of you to do your patriotic duty and take a drink, and you won't find any environmentalists in front of you. Of course, comprehensive development plans are the tools of choice in nearly every city of the nation to produce the proper smart growth community. Through these plans, energy and water is tightly controlled. And the third way to sustainable development, inside the cities and towns, government is steadily coming under the control of groups, private groups called stakeholder councils. These are mostly non-governmental organizations or NGOs, basically the same groups who helped write Agenda 21, and this is the specific process being used to bring Agenda 21 into your local level. They'll argue that they are all a locally driven process. The function of legitimate elected government within the sustainabilist system is fast becoming little more than a rubber stamp to create and enforce the dictates of the councils. Once the councils are established, it becomes nearly impossible to discuss issues with your local elected representatives. This is where the real change in America's system of government is taking place, and this is the process we are most objecting to. This is top-down control of a centrally planned economy. They can dictate the kind of building materials you may use in your home or whether you can build on your property at all. They can decide if roads are built, how much water is to be used, how downtowns will look through historic preservation, how neighborhoods will be built. The bottom line is that the conservation and development policies that are pouring out of every level of government are not originally coming from local, state, or national ideas, but find their roots clearly outlined in an international policy called Agenda 21. And it is equally clear that an army of NGOs teamed with very significant federal agencies are working hand in hand to impose what was first introduced to the world in 1992. Those enforcing this policy, armed with a basic disregard for private property, reason, or honor, seem to stop at nothing to achieve their goal of top-down control of government and of everything connected to your daily lives. You need to understand such a mindset and the policies behind it to fully understand what drives federal and state agents who come into your community to enforce it. Let me give you just a few examples of what is happening to ordinary Americans just trying to live their lives through this wrenching transformation of our nation. I'm sure you've heard of the infamous Supreme Court decision Kelo versus New London, in which the Supreme Court, the designated protectors of the Constitution, obliterated American private property rights in determining that a community could take any property it wants for private use. But what you may not have heard is the story of the intimidation brought down on the property owners in this case who just wanted to keep their homes. After a year of intimidation and harassment by the city government, which included phone calls at all hours, government officials knocking on their doors, insisting that homeowners sign contracts to sell their homes, finally, some homeowners began to cave into the pressure and sell. Immediately, a bulldozer was dispatched to knock down the home, and then the bulldozer was parked in front of the next home. The process was repeated over and over again until the neighborhood looked like a war zone. Finally, roads were blocked, denying residents access to their homes. The city government never had a reason to take the land, to even want it. There was no plan in place. It was just decided to take the property. In a little community in Nevada called Jarbidge, there was an earthquake that moved rocks and debris into the road to blocked access to the town. The worst was a 5-ton rock that literally closed the road. People couldn't get in or out. Jarbidge is located in the Humboldt National Forest and so comes under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Forest Service. The Forest Service used the road, the blocked road, as an opportunity to stop public access to public lands as part of the Wildlands Project. So they issued an order that this rock was not to be removed, 5 tons. On July 4th, 2000, hundreds of people from around the country set up the Jarbidge Shovel Brigade, and they came out and they moved it in violation and defiance of the Forest Service. This is happening across the country, and I don't have time to go through them all. But let me tell you this. These are not the actions of a free society. Americans were granted a right through the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution to be secure in their homes. This is raw government power unchecked and growing out of control. This is Agenda 21, an international policy that does not recognize America's unique form of government that was designed to protect individuals from government power, and it has no place in American society. Citizens in your community need a champion who will be there to stand for them and against the unreasonable forces of federal and state government. By standing up for the Constitution, you, the sheriffs of America, are our last line of defense. Thank you very much.